All right, so chapter 4, let's talk about the structure of Genesis chapter 4. Whoops, hang in here. All right, so where did you guys put the end of the first section, and how did you just summarize it?
I say verses 1 and 2. Cain and Abel are born. They're born.
Yep.
And it tells them what their occupations are.
God provides two sons.
Right? Maybe the promise is coming. The son's going to be born that will crush the serpent's head. All right, maybe not.
All right, so then,
Verse 3. So we've got our characters kind of introduced. And where does the next kind of section go?
3 to 7.
3 to 7, okay. Yep. And so, how did you guys kind of summarize verses 3 to 7?
There were offerings made. One was accepted, one was rejected.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So offerings made, one's kind of rejected.
The best offering was accepted.
The best offering accepted. Yep. I'm trying to think. So there's the part of the offerings, but there's also kind of a conversation between Yahweh and Cain there too, right?
Corrected it.
Sorry, what?
Corrected Cain.
Yeah. So we probably want that in the summary, because it's not just about the offerings. It's also, right, that there's this idea that,
Cain fails to please God with his offering and is warned against sin, right? So God comes to him and says, hey, you got a choice here,
right? You've fallen short. What are you going to do about that? And sin is crouching at the door, and it wants more, right? And so then, what's kind of the next section? Verse 8 to where?
I just said verse 8 alone.
Verse 8 alone. Kind of Cain kills his brother.
Cain kills his brother.
Yep.
And then this reminds me a little bit of the previous chapter.
Yeah. Where God kind of comes looking for.
Comes looking for him. So God questions Cain, just like he questioned Adam.
Yep.
God questions Cain.
Yep. So if verse 8 is Cain kills Abel, where would the next section you'd say ends? And why? So verse 9 to where?
Well, 9 through 10 is where he questions him.
Yep.
11 through 12 is when he pronounces judgment.
Yep. And then 13 to where would be the next section?
13 to 14 is Cain gives a response.
Yep.
15 to 16, God's final response, and then Cain departs.
Yep. All right. What about the script back there? Did you guys break it down similarly? Did you group it more together? How did you guys do it?
We put it more together.
Okay.
Put from 8 to 14.
Okay, 8 to 14 together.
Consequences of
Okay. And then did you guys do then 15 and 16 together?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm just going to do 8 to 16 to keep it kind of simple up here. You guys all see, right? This all is part of this kind of back and forth, right? You can subdivide it, but there's this back and forth between Cain and God, right?
So Cain kills Abel.
It's like, man, we went from paradise in chapter 2 to 2 chapters later, we now have brothers killing each other. I mean, it goes downhill real fast.
Cain kills Abel, and God pronounces judgment. Now, does he only pronounce judgment, or is there anything else he does?
He also protects them.
Yeah, he kind of shows mercy, doesn't he, in protecting him. Yeah, which again, we're seeing this we're seeing something really beautiful about God here, aren't we? He's just and he's merciful, right? Great. So then in verse 17, where does that section go to? 24? 22. I like going to 24. You could say 22 or 23 and 24 is kind of a subsection, right? But it's part of that Lamech narrative, but he's got this little poem, right? Yeah. How did you guys try to summarize kind of Cain's heritage?
Genealogy of what's going on.
And what is Cain's heritage? How would you summarize what Cain's heritage is?
There were a number of generations
Mm-hmm.
that came after him.
Yep.
He had a son, and the son had just
Yep.
after a few generations, down to this fellow Lamech.
Yep. And Lamech's a pretty good guy, right? He thinks highly of himself. Yeah, right? I mean, he's like, and he's like, hey, some young man wounded me, so I killed him. So, like, it feels like the evil's increased, doesn't it? And he's got 2 wives. It's the first mention of polygamy, right? So there's another problem, right? He's deviating from God's norm. So Cain's heritage equals more sin. And what's really interesting is Lamech is the 7th generation. He's the 7th in the line. If you count the line, he's number 7. And it's really interesting in chapter 5, when we look at Seth's line, number 7 is Enoch, who walked with God. So there's kind of almost like this contrast that we see between these 2 lines, right? So Cain's heritage is more sin. And then what's kind of the last section then? 25 and 26, and how would you guys summarize that section?
I said a son is born to Adam and Eve to begin a new generation and replace in lieu of Abel.
Yep, so God provides a new son. And is there anything else that's really significant in this section?
I was really surprised to read that, like at this point, at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Yeah, first began to worship the Lord. That was surprising to me that it's taken that long.
Right, so and this is where we got to remember kind of like the history here. So it's in the time period of Seth, which is just one generation from Adam and Eve that this is happening, right? So we kind of like gone down all these generations, and Cain, now it's like we're backtracking. And it's like at this time over here, people begin to call upon the name of the Lord. But it's pretty interesting, right? So this here is contrasted to all of this, isn't it? Right? So we've got 2 different lines being contrasted, right? So Seth picks up Abel's line, so to speak, right? And then you've got this other line, right? So we have these 2 different contrasts. So sin's in the world, but there's 2 different ways of responding to sin, isn't there?
Do we know sort of how much later Seth was than Cain?
No.
No.
It's one of those things we just don't know. Yeah.
In that end of chapter 26, at that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord.
Yep.
What about Adam and Eve? I mean, before, we're talking Seth,
Yep.
which is a descendant of theirs,
Yep.
and it's got to be a number of years later because it happens after Abel.
Yep.
He's already been killed by Cain.
Yep.
Were Adam and Eve not having contact with the Lord?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
It just seems strange that, because in the text you've got God talking with Cain,
Yep.
and now they get this statement in 26, it just
Yeah.
seems that
Yeah, so it's interesting. So call upon the name of the Lord, right, would be like prayer, right? That's kind of a phrase used for prayer. So you think about it, Adam and Eve are used to talking with God direct, face to face, And probably God comes and talks to Cain too, right? And so here you've got now people that are praying to the Lord that maybe aren't talking to him direct, face to face, right? So
So this put them outside of Eden,
yeah,
so they're in a whole new.
a whole new environment, right? Like before it used to be normal just to talk with God face to face, and now there is still a relationship with God, but it's different outside of Eden. God still will show up from time to time. We'll see that in the life of Abraham and other times, but it's not this consistent presence like it was before, right? So I wonder if that's maybe the difference. I don't know for sure if that answers the question, and it could just be that we just don't know, But I wonder if that's part of what's going on here is that Adam and Eve didn't call upon the name of the Lord in terms of praying to him because they were used to just talking to him. And now outside of the garden, and it doesn't say that Adam and Eve don't call upon the Lord, right? It just says at that time. So it could be like he's saying, now outside of the garden, Adam and Eve and their son Seth and his grandson, they're all now at that time calling upon them. They're starting to pray because that's how they're relating to God now, outside of the garden. That's a great question. Yeah. So how did you guys try to write the main point here? All right, well, if you think about our structure here, and we got these two contrasts, maybe our main point says something about that, right? So option one, how do we sum up the story of option one here?
Disobedience leads to estrangement from God, or
Yeah, how about, I'll just add this, and it leads to death and further alienation from God.
can you read that again?
Disobedience/sin leads to death and further alienation from God. And I'll add this in, when it is not resisted. And I'm just adding that in because that seems to be God's instructions, right? That the way you avoid that is you resist sin, right? So disobedience/sin leads to death and further alienation from God when it is not resisted.
And
Yep.
I guess part of that, I don't know if it needs to be added, but it seemed like a part of that is what we see in verses 17 to 24, where it isn't just Cain.
Right.
This
It's
is going down through
generations now. Yep.
This
Yep.
is sin.
Yep. It says sin is spreading. It's growing. Right. Yep.
And that's the sin nature that they got from Adam.
Yep. Yep.
Because Cain and Abel weren't born until after they were expelled. Adam
Yep.
and Eve were expelled from the garden.
Yep. Exactly. So they're born in a world where there is no perfect relation with God, but instead they're born in a world where their propensity is towards sin. Yep. Yep. Right. Maybe let's take a but, because what's kind of the opposite here?
There's still the idea of mercy in there,
Yeah.
that God gives mercy.
But God gives mercy.
And people can obey.
Yeah.
And they have to obey.
Yeah. And then what?
Worship.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we can use that language of call on the Lord to get that right. But God gives mercy to all who call upon Him. Does that sound like an okay? Yeah. So let's think about, how does this point us to Christ, right? Does this feel like a kind of a command? What do people think?
There is a command at 7.
Yeah.
Do what is right. Sin is eager to control you.
Yep. So this whole like resisting sin, right? So Christ is the one who perfectly resists sin, right? For us. Yep. So like when we look at this passage, we go, okay, this isn't the end of the story, right? There is one who could come and perfectly resist sin and die for us so that we can receive the mercy, right? Which, I mean, that's pretty amazing, right? That like, because we're all tempted by sin and we all fall short, and yet we can receive mercy. Why? Because of Jesus, right? And that's pretty amazing. So how do you think we're supposed to respond to this in terms of kind of application or intended response that flows from this?
Like in our own lives. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if we think about how are we to respond to this, so let's try to make sure application flows from the point of the passage, right? In light of Christ. What's maybe some possible applications?
To call upon the Lord and to help us resist sin.
Yeah, so trust, call upon God, resist sin with His help. Yep. I'm going to add this, who gives mercy, right? I think this is really important because like one ditch we could fall into, right, as humans is we could say, well, God's going to be merciful, so I don't need to resist sin, right? And this passage would say, no, we are called to resist sin, right? That even if we're still going to fall into sin some of the time, we're still called to fight and resist sin. In fact, because Jesus did it for us, and He's given us His Holy Spirit, we actually are empowered to resist sin, right? We are able to do that now with His help in a way we couldn't have before. But the other ditch could be, I got to try really, really hard to kind of resist sin on my own strength, right? And it's like, well, that's not going to work because we're still going to fall short. The answer instead is we trust and call upon God, right? Who saves, who shows mercy, right? Yep, Chris?
One of the things, same like Adam and Eve tried to hide
Yep.
from God that they sinned, same Cain tried to hide.
Yes. Yeah, good point.
Also, I would say also confess.
Yes, confess. So that's a great. Yeah, so we need to confess as we trust in Him, right? And not be like Adam and Eve who blame shifted, or Cain who's like, what, brother? What are you talking about? As if he could fool God. But sometimes we do that too, right? Right? So part of trusting, calling upon Him is confession, right? That we resist sin, but if we fall into sin, we have the path of confession and forgiveness because of Jesus, right? And that makes me want to resist sin more, right? Because of what Jesus has done for us, right? So we're seeing that inside. So Genesis 4 now is kind of showing us, like, inside a sinful, broken world, there's two ways to live, right? You can give in to sin, and it spreads and grows, or we can, by God's grace, resist sin, confess if we fall into it, seek forgiveness, right, and be transformed, right? That's life now in this broken world. So these first 4 chapters, again, it's a really good overview, right? First 2 chapters, here's what the world's supposed to be like. Chapter 3, here's how it went wrong. Chapter 4, here's how we're now to respond and live in a broken, sinful world, right? That this is the new pattern.
And then like in both of them, like when they got removed further from God.
Yep.
They left Eden, but then he also
Yeah.
was sent to wander. There was
Yes, and actually that's kind of something we talked about, but they leave from Eden to the east. Cain wanders further east, so east tends to be the direction away from God in Genesis. It's kind of something that's interesting to note.